Welcome everybody to an overview of Colorado's Strategic Growth Report, including an update on policy recommendations. This is September 12th of 2025. I'm Scott Williamson, Land Use and Water Planner with the Community Development Office within the Department of Local Affairs. I'm joined by Mary Chase and Bob Parker from Echo Northwest, our consultants working closely on this project. First, an overview of the Strategic Growth Report and what was required by recent legislation. So Senate Bill 24174 requires DOLA to submit the Strategic Growth Report by the end of October 2025. And there are certain elements that report needs to include. And the draft recommendations that we've come up with that you'll see previewed today reflect a combination of extensive research, analysis, and input, what we've heard on the policy areas that were initially published for the Strategic Growth Report. There are also a couple concurrent efforts that we want to draw your attention to, also included under Senate Bill 24174, and those are the strategic growth element and water supply elements that are now required in comprehensive plans. And guidance will be developed for the strategic growth element and then enhanced guidance for the water supply element as well. And those will be available as drafts by mid-November, and with a goal of publishing a final by the beginning of the next year. And then the Vital Landscapes and Resources Report, which I'll preview on the next slide, must be completed by the end of December of 2025. A little bit more about how these different pieces interrelate and what is and isn't part of the Strategic Growth Report. So the Strategic Growth Report is focused on analysis of growth trends within Colorado, as well as land use scenarios based on a business as usual and strategic growth scenario. And that's across a variety of metrics required in Senate Bill 24174. That includes things such as impact on water supply, impact on the cost and availability of housing, and a variety of other metrics. That will also include a list of statewide policy recommendations as we're reviewing today. And then the Vital Landscapes and Resources Report is focused more on what Colorado protects and connects, whereas the Strategic Growth Report is focused on how and where Colorado builds. And so that Vital Landscapes and Resources Report will include a list of best practices, opportunities, and resources in the form of the Vital Landscapes and Resources Planning Guide. And then combined between these two reports will be a local policy toolkit that provides an inventory of tools available for local governments as well as regional entities. And there's a nexus with new comprehensive plan elements because local governments can take a look at these tools and see what's appropriate for a potential action plan within a comprehensive plan. So it's really important as we enter into discussion of this report to come to agreement on a definition of strategic growth. So the draft definition that the project team came up with for strategic growth as informed by Senate Bill 24174 is as follows. Strategic growth is a fiscally and environmentally sustainable approach to land use planning, housing, community well-being, and infrastructure that promotes the development or redevelopment of vacant and underutilized infill parcels and mitigates the need for extensions of infrastructure and public services into natural and agricultural lands. And forming the basis of the analysis that the team did for the Strategic Growth Report is the transect that you see below. We recognize that there's a spectrum of land uses, and this varies by regional context within Colorado. But generally, we broke this transect into 5 different pieces that form that basis of that analysis. And those place types are rural places, suburban places, traditional neighborhoods, downtown places, and the urban core. I'll now hand it over to Mary to talk a little bit more about the Strategic Growth Report policy scan.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Before we dive into the recommendations, we wanted to briefly recap the policy scan that the project team put out in June of this year. This was our starting point that is intended as a neutral inventory where we identify a range of land use, infrastructure, and water policy areas you'll see on the next few slides that help to shape Colorado's growth trends. So this list includes both policy areas that were required by Senate Bill 24174 and a more expanded list of topics that our team added to give us a full foundation of the areas most critical for statewide attention. This list was circulated for comment through the end of July to allow for input on which areas were the priority for our focus. The land use policy scan that you see here covered 11 different areas. Some of them, like neighborhood centers, transfer of development rights, annexation, and urban growth areas, they were specifically called out in the legislation, and others that you see here on the list, which aren't in bold, like vested rights, airport noise conflicts, those came out of our team's contributions and early stakeholder input on the project. On the infrastructure side, we added a few things here too, like urban service areas, corridor planning, on top of those that were already required in Senate Bill 174. And these are still available on the DOLA website for folks to review in more detail. Um, Finally, water policies weren't explicitly listed in the legislation, but it really quickly became clear as we were working through this process that it had to be part of the report and that is going to be a big part of our recommendations in some capacity. So we scanned 9 policy areas listed here. And just to note that the intent of this policy scan was not to create a laundry list of way too many recommendations to be implemented, but really to give us a thorough context and help narrow things down to what's the most relevant right now to feed into our final recommendations. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about our engagement that we've done. The policy scan that we shared is really just half of this story, and our team has heard from local governments, state agencies, water providers, and other community stakeholders throughout the project. This next set of slides is going to summarize some of the themes from those different conversations. Just to ground us a little bit too, this is a summary of how Senate Bill 24174 requires engagement to be part of the strategic growth report, and who it required us to engage with, including state agencies, local governments, different experts in various fields, and water and utility providers, and really trying to get a full spectrum of input, which we've done through focus groups, webinars, other smaller meetings, and written feedback. This slide here shows a timeline of what we've done through each phase of the Strategic Growth Report's development. In early 2025, we focused on existing conditions and research, and we shared some of that initial framing with a first round of focus groups and a meeting with the Interagency Council. Into the spring, our team worked on defining inputs and scenarios with a parallel webinar with the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute, which is available as a recording on the DOLA website. As well as a focus group with water policy folks and a Google form for written feedback on the policy area scan that we just shared. Over the last few months, we've engaged with a variety of different focus groups on refining some of those policy options and initial recommendations. As of this presentation as well, we currently have a Google form up for feedback on the transect and scenario analysis that will be open through September 23rd. And this fall, we are in the stage of finalizing recommendations and preparing the final report that will also have opportunity for written feedback before our deadline on October 31st. So I'm going to give a flyover of some of the themes we've heard from each round of engagement. As we were starting this project and sharing some of the initial framing, we heard clearly the need for a statewide framework that still allows for local flexibility, and at the same time, the importance of cross-sector collaboration, and that this effort can't really be done in a vacuum. And third, an important note that we heard was to be careful about distinguishing between fiscal sustainability, like service costs, and environmental sustainability. So we've tried to build that into the foundation of the full report. We also heard in this phase about integrating climate and conservation goals with strategic growth, like wildfire adaptation, protecting natural resources, recreation, and access to the outdoors are really central to where people want to live and visit in Colorado. So We also heard about emphasizing the importance of open space planning and connection to that vital landscapes and resources report that Scott talked about earlier on in this presentation, which also connects to what we heard from stakeholders about acknowledging wildlife movement and priority habitats within strategic growth decision making. This slide just summarizes some of the themes we heard from that Google form that was circulated on the policy areas, where we asked reviewers to rank their top priorities for more discussion and analysis in the report. Financing tools and corridor planning surface to the top, which you'll see as a theme throughout a lot of this, followed by water and land use integration. 1041 regulations and economic incentives also made that list. And you'll see these areas reflected in our recommendations here in a moment once I pass it off to my colleague, Bob Parker. Finally, last point here, I'm going to talk through some of the key inputs we've gotten that have shaped up the draft recommendations, like those Google form priority areas, corridor and regional planning, and clarifying financing and incentives really rose to the top in these conversations, and the need to coordinate across organizations and align some of those available incentives to encourage strategic growth and help to enable it. Housing and specifically barriers related to zoning and housing supply to enable density came up in those conversations. Just a few more here before we move on to the recommendations themselves that stakeholders really stressed that recommendations need to work statewide and have options that work for rural and mountain communities as well as the Front Range. They mentioned the link between conservation and growth and recognizing some of the key pressures and opportunities to align with other statewide initiatives. Uh, Finally, here, our water groups in particular surface the importance of water efficient development, regional coordination on reuse and supply planning, and the alignment of local water policies with other community priorities like housing, economic development, and others. So now I'm going to pass it off to Bob to start us on our initial set of recommendations.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So a few things about the recommendations, just to tee this up. There's three bins of recommendations: land use, infrastructure, and water. As the slide says, these recommendations, as we're presenting them at this point, are not in an order of priority. Each recommendation's got a set of um, bullets around the rationale for the recommendation, and for our research recommendations, there are a set of research questions. As we started collecting all the information and processing through the data for the strategic growth report, it became pretty clear to us that uh, the complexity of policies that we're working with suggested that more work would be prudent prior to addressing legislative initiatives. And so what we came up with respect to land use and infrastructure, a set of research recommendations. And the intent with the research recommendations is to really dig in and better understand the extent of the problems, the issues related to the specific recommendation, and then identify a spectrum of policy options and hopefully ultimately choose the policy option that best fits the problem and the need of the state. So the first recommendation is around better understanding barriers to housing options in infill places. And Senate Bill 24-174 has a strong emphasis on promoting infill. We recognize that there has been considerable legislation related to housing, and that housing framework now is quite robust, but there are still gaps in our view that suggest that this type of research could help fill some of those. So there's a set of zoning challenges and barriers beyond zoning that can include things like review processes, jurisdictional capacity, incentives, and so on. And we also want to account for market factors and development costs. So infill can be challenging in many communities, and understanding how zoning interacts with housing markets is important. The potential research questions around this one are: what are the most important gaps that need to be filled to support the infill housing development beyond what's already been adopted recently? And two, which policy reforms lend themselves to simple solutions that have a consistent impact across the state. So thinking about things that could be broadly applied to communities and have impact, but also thinking about things that reflect regional or local differences in communities, front range communities, mountain communities, resort communities, and the idea that not every barrier is the same in each community and not every policy is going to fit in each community. The second recommendation that we have related to land use is around orderly and strategic expansion of existing urban areas. So really thinking about policies that would guide growth to be adjacent to existing urban areas and think about orderly outward expansion of communities. This is important because in part the state's got a set of policies and procedures that exist that help guide expansion of urban areas, but they've got limited coordination or cross-reference. So thinking about how things like 3 mile plans, area plans, regional transportation plans can work together to support strategic growth and orderly expansion of Colorado communities. And it also helps Colorado direct growth into places where infrastructure, transit, and services can be provided most cost effectively. So there's an efficiency element to this particular recommendation. The research questions around this are first, what are the current trends with respect to exurban growth in Colorado? How much of it is occurring? At what densities? Are there areas where it appears to be occurring more and is more impactful to orderly expansion? Second, how do other states fund or support regional coordination roles? So thinking about the fact that expansion of urban areas is not necessarily limited to an individual jurisdiction, that there may be multiple local governments and other organizations that are involved in that, and that effort needs to be coordinated amongst those organizations. Third, how can we understand when greenfield development is following principles of strategic growth? The strategic growth report goes through the set of principles that define strategic growth, and uh, that's, I think, pretty well articulated at this point. But thinking about what are the criteria that we use to determine that we're actually achieving the growth outcomes that are envisioned by Senate Bill 24-174. Fourth, what policy levers or tools are likely to be most impactful and feasible in supporting strategic growth? And then finally, what does orderly and strategic expansion look like in rural versus urban areas of Colorado? And there are profound differences between those communities and how they develop and who they serve. So this is an instance where uh, what appears to be orderly in the Front Range may be less so or less appropriate in mountain or resort communities. The third recommendation around land use relates to pairing opportunities for strategic growth with strategic conservation. And as Mary said, this has been a theme that's come up throughout our engagement in the project. It relates to the Vital Lands and Agriculture Report. And it's important because Coloradoans value parks and open space, and they provide important amenities to residents and communities and are also an important economic activity. Habitat conservation and migration corridors are important for many species. There's value to ecosystem services, natural resources, and working agricultural lands. And then finally, thinking about mitigating risks associated with development in hazardous areas. And the research questions around this one are, how can regional efforts looking at conservation be effectively integrated with local strategic growth elements and strategic land use decision making? So understanding there's a new requirement established by Senate Bill 24-174 for local governments to adopt strategic growth elements and ensuring that they're not just looking at um, strategic growth management, but also thinking about how does open space, habitat conservation, and those other values fit into our overall growth strategy. And secondly, how can conservation programs or policy tools support strategic conservation and strategic growth decisions? What can we learn from other states around funding priorities, transfer development rights policies, um, mapping strategies, and so on? That is the final land use recommendation. I want to summarize a little bit what we've heard in our engagement to date. The themes that have come out of the various engagement steps that we've taken are first, context matters. Uh, the policies need to consider growth patterns and conditions in rural or small town contexts as well as urban areas. Infill development has large potential but faces barriers like outdated zoning codes and lengthy approval processes, as well as public input into land use decisions. So policies that make infill more affordable and less complicated while making sprawl less attractive will help support strategic land growth, land use. Growth and conservation are closely linked, so land use tools should align conservation priorities and ensure development doesn't undermine open space and habitat conservation. And then finally, strategic growth should also consider economics, so housing affordability, the viability of projects, both as infill projects as well as in more traditional growth. Uh, from the Google form, we got three policy areas to explore: economic incentives, 1041 regulations, and neighborhood centers. And then the recommendations that came out on top in our focus group meetings have been local government advocates and regional governments see aligning transportation and planning as an important consideration, and then aligning strategic growth and transportation decisions has also emerged as a priority. Moving on, we're going to go into the infrastructure policy recommendations next. And again, these three recommendations are all research recommendations around how to better understand the nature of the problem and develop and craft policy options that are persuasive to the issues that we're looking at. So the first recommendation under infrastructure relates to the alignment of strategic growth, transportation, and transportation decision making. Next slide, Mary. And this is important to instill more confidence in planning for transit-oriented development with strategic funding support for transit service. So ensuring that development is supporting transit and supporting investments in transit, and then aligning efforts to support successful nodes and corridors, neighborhood centers, uh, greenhouse gas standards, transit-oriented communities under House Bill 24/1313, and so on. The research questions related to this are: how can Colorado address barriers and improve corridor level coordination across jurisdictions to align land use and transportation planning? Uh, so really thinking about a coordination aspect of that. And what policy approaches can ensure transit-oriented centers and neighborhood centers are walkable, bikeable, and well integrated with transit service on both state and local roadways. So really looking at approaches to support land use that supports transit in this instance. The second research recommendation around infrastructure is to optimize public infrastructure financing tools for strategic growth. So this is important to equip local governments to leverage tools for value capture to fund infrastructure in what is ultimately a fiscally constrained environment. Um, and many financing tools have improved and been adjusted over time, but not as a suite. So thinking about how the various tools work together and can reinforce each other to support the kind of growth outcomes envisioned by Senate Bill 24/174. The research questions around this one are: what could improve tools that finance and fund infrastructure, the existing tools like URAs, TIFs, metro districts, and so on, effectively filling infrastructure gaps that produce neighborhood centers and transit-oriented centers. So thinking about really how to fund those desired centers. And then second, do special districts have the capacity to accommodate desired infill growth that local jurisdictions are planning for? And it is the case that there's a patchwork of special districts that provide various services in Colorado, and ensuring that those districts have the capacity to support the growth will be important considerations as local governments move forward uh, with promoting neighborhood centers, transit-oriented developments, and so on. And then the final research recommendation around infrastructure is to align incentives to grow strategically. It's important because there's a need for sustainable funding to remove infrastructure barriers to infill. Infill can often be more expensive um, than greenfield development. Recognizing the role of taxing powers and fiscalizing growth decisions, municipal sales tax reliance, and how governments are sometimes making land use decisions that maximize their revenue return from sales tax. Delegation of infrastructure financing and related growth decisions to special districts with their own infrastructure incentive structures. So recognizing that districts may have different motives for their decision making than strategic growth or than their local government partners. And then finally, the role of direct or indirect spatial criteria and economic incentives in other state programs. There's three research questions around this one. How does local taxing authority influence growth patterns? What criteria should local governments look for in their special district approval and oversight processes that support or encourage strategic growth? And finally, do any state incentive programs or prioritization criteria encourage unsustainable growth patterns or undesired growth patterns? That is the final of the infrastructure recommendations. What we've heard so far related to these recommendations are one, infrastructure is not keeping up with where communities want to grow. So thinking about tools to provide additional capacity that supports infill and redevelopment should be a priority. Current financing tools such as special districts were designed for greenfield projects and don't work as well for infill or transit-oriented development. So reforming those tools to be more supportive of the desired growth patterns will be important. Transportation infrastructure has many opportunities and challenges. So thinking about better corridor planning, linking land use decisions with transportation investments will lead to more efficient growth in the future. From our Google form, three policy areas to explore emerged: corridor planning, financing tools, and urban service areas. And then the urgent and important recommendations that came out of our focus group. Local government advocates saw transportation infrastructure financing tools as urgent and important, and state agency experts prioritized pairing opportunities for strategic growth and conservation. That is the end of the land use and transportation or infrastructure recommendations. So I'll turn it back to Mary, and Mary is going to talk through the water policy and recommendations.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I'll take it back from here to walk through our recommendations related to water supply. This section is just a little different from the infrastructure and land use ones that we just walked through, in that it has both some of those recommended areas for deeper research and areas that are ready for action and build on some of the momentum from the Colorado Water Plan. And you'll see both of those in these next couple of slides here. Um, Again, our first few recommendations are going to focus on those areas for research. And this first one is focused on finding ways to better match municipal water supply with community priorities. And like we noted here at the top, this could be water allocation, dedication, entitlements, or other policies. In many parts of Colorado, water is already limited, and some jurisdictions have already allocated many future water entitlements, which shapes where development can or can't go today. So this research topic focuses on identifying how to match up water supply with local community priorities, which could be housing or economic development or others, depending again on local context. And some of the key questions we've identified are digging into what enabling authorities support water allocation policies, what are the challenges to implementing those policies, and then what opportunities exist to align water dedication policies with strategic growth approaches and community priorities, again, which can be locally identified and might not look the same everywhere. As well as how existing water entitlements and water adequacy determinations for undeveloped land impact the state's goal of strategic growth, and how, to align those policies to reflect those local values and some of those shared goals as well. Moving on to our second water topic, this focuses on finding ways to address the impacts of water transfers and that intersection with land use and agriculture planning. when water is permanently transferred from agricultural lands to urban development, it can have big impacts on communities. And this also directly aligns with some actions in the Colorado Water Plan agency actions, 2.5 and 2.6 specifically. Um, at the same time, we know that water transfers will continue to happen as cities grow, and our focus groups have pointed out examples of different models for identifying highly productive agricultural lands and different ways that those can be prioritized. Um, in our potential research questions, these are set up to dig into what the existing tools are that help to identify and protect those highly productive agricultural lands. And one sub-research question that we have here is more specifically, what tools can avoid, minimize, or mitigate the impact of water transfers from uh, scenarios that permanently remove water from agricultural lands and serve new growth in urban areas, and how to address that. This starts to feed into the next recommendation I'll get to here, or some that we'll get to in a minute, around regional supply and also data availability. Um, this recommendation really reflects a theme we've heard throughout engagement in the process about the need to improve how water supply and demand information is collected and shared. Uh, right now, we've heard from folks that that system can be difficult. Some providers have more detailed data, others have more limited capacity, and some challenges like service area boundaries aren't always the most transparent. Um, these challenges can make it difficult for syncing things up and getting a clearer picture of water supply and demand. And there are some opportunities for further research that surfaced from our conversations, um, including a recommendation around GIS data sets, how we can try to standardize some more of that reporting, and approaches for estimating water demand, as well as trying to develop as simple mechanisms as possible to connect water reporting to service area boundaries in a way that can work for different levels of capacity by different water providers and systems. Um, Moving into our last two recommendations here, these ones do get into some areas for action that are beyond just research. Um, this one focuses on promoting water efficient development, which really came through as a big priority in our focus groups. Colorado's population is growing and the water supply does not. We put the language of promoting, incentivizing, or requiring water efficient development just to acknowledge that different contexts and what might be appropriate. And one of the big benefits of water efficiency is this first bullet about helping to provide more housing with less impact on land area and just in a generally more efficient way throughout the state and recognizing all of those different local conditions. Um, some of the specific areas for action here involve encouraging land use codes that incentivize or might in some cases require water efficient development depending on local decisions, and making sure to integrate water demand considerations for large municipal users, which could include data centers or others. And this last bullet here addresses some of the uncertainty in the federal environment and exploring potential for state programs around water efficient development, depending on the status of those in the long run. And our final recommendation here related to water is to encourage regionalization of water efficiency and reuse and supply planning. Again, regional coordination was another of those big overarching themes that we heard across areas, and we wanted to get more specific here and acknowledge exactly like it says on the slide that the next phase of water planning in Colorado will likely need direct potable reuse of existing supplies, and that means regional collaboration in a lot of cases. Um, some examples of that in Colorado came up during our conversations, like the WISE program, Denver One Water Plan, the South Platte River Opportunities Working Group. And on the right here, we have some of those opportunities for further action, and looking for places to integrate regional water efficiency, land use, and agriculture, and thinking of those as linked policy areas for regions. Developing frameworks to manage those opportunities and impacts of direct potable reuse is also one of those areas that really came up as a direct opportunity and exploring mitigating impacts to source communities from water transfers. So here's a summary of what we've heard from these initial recommendations, which I think I started to get at as we went through here. But from the Google form that we put out on those policy areas, people ranked some of their top choices as water supply and land use, considerations for uh, water supply, land use, and agriculture. And again, that water supply data and mapping component. And in our focus groups with local government advocates and regional governments, there was a lot of emphasis on matching municipal water supply and community priorities. And then with a longer term view, thinking about improving water data as something that's important, but recognizing that it may take some time to align that and find the right areas. Our conversations with water experts and providers are where we really heard a lot about water efficient development, regionalization of water planning. And again, that group also emphasized improving data collection as something that's an important consideration. Just talking through a few of those other points, water efficient development, again, was a really high priority that came up throughout our conversations, as well as the need for better data transparency as much as possible and improving consistency with GIS and other data sets available. Water transfers, as we have here on this list, and effects on agricultural and rural communities. We've noted as being something that's really needed for careful consideration, and that local water policy can be aligned to support local priorities. So again, thinking about what those different contexts are across the state and how communities can work across regions to make sure that they're able to align water policies with other areas. And that concludes our summary of these recommendations. I'm going to pass it back to Scott just to wrap us up and share some of the next steps for the strategic growth report process.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary and Bob, for outlining those policy recommendations. We're looking forward to your feedback on these policy recommendations throughout the coming weeks. And I'll just outline a few next steps here. So we have conducted some focus groups with water experts, state policy experts, the Vital Landscapes and Resources Group, and local governments, as Mary and Bob acknowledged. We'll also have a final draft of the Strategic Growth Report available on DOLA's website alongside these policy recommendations, and that will be open for comment with a feedback form. And then the Vital Landscapes and Resources Report, we went through our first round of engagement on that, currently revising the planning guide based on input we received, and we'll be re-releasing that in October for broad and through November for broad agency and public review of the final draft. And then once again, we really look forward to receiving your input via that Google form, which we will link in the posted slides for your feedback on these recommendations. And that will also be available on DOLA's website. So thank you for your interest and your time in watching this webinar, and appreciate your continued engagement. Thanks so much.